Okay, welcome everyone. So let's go ahead and get started. Um, I'm super happy to have everyone here and to welcome Dr. Nick Walker. I've never introduced anyone before, so I was trying to think about what to say as part of an introduction. Um, and there's, of course, sort of the basic introduction parts. So Nick is, of course, a queer trans autistic writer and professor in somatic psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies, also managing editor of the publishing house Autonomous Press, and most well known for work on neurodiversity paradigm and neuroqueer theory, which has been incredibly impactful in my own work and life. I am by no means a sort of into believer of like mystical things, but I do often pull tarot cards to help me with introspection. And so I pulled a tarot card to think about what to say as part of this opening. I pulled from one deck and got the Sin of Wrath, so I didn't want to go with that one. We'll skip the Sin of Wrath. But I pulled from another deck and got the Queen of Pentacles, which felt very relevant to this talk and to what Nick has kind of meant to both myself and my work. So I'm just going to read quickly a quick description of the Queen of Pentacles. Abundance through care. Care of planning, care of one's career or financial situation, of the self and of the community. The warmth and growth of that abundance and hard work and the richness of that success, the independence and victory that results, building a home in the image of one's true idea of what a home should be and inviting others in. Queen of Pentacles will not only show you love, but will also show you the way forward whenever you seem to be stranded and confused. She offers precaution, principles, and support, all lessons that she has learned in her personal life. Because she's a self-made woman, she wants too for you to be independent and wise, such that you are also able to raise others and make them responsible. So as I read that, it felt very impactful to me, very relevant. Okay. With all of that being said, let's go ahead and turn it over. Join me in welcoming Dr. Nick Walker.
Thank you, Matthew. That was a wonderful introduction. I have never been introduced with a tarot card description before, and it was beautiful. Thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, good. Okay then. Welcome. Yeah, so we have a little time here, an hour or so together to talk about the ethics of the neurodiversity paradigm. And I'm going to talk for a bit, but I really like discussion and I like to make sure that I'm addressing what my particular audience actually finds relevant. So I'll talk for a bit and then we're going to do some Q&A for a while. So ethics of the neurodiversity paradigm. I don't know exactly the background of all of you or how familiar you are with this whole concept of the neurodiversity paradigm, but let me talk a little bit about it. So neurodiversity is the diversity among human body minds and modes of neurocognitive functioning. And this was a concept that emerged originally within the autistic community in the 1990s and developed, what evolved was a neurodiversity movement, which was primarily a social justice movement around civil rights for autistic people and other neurominority groups, ADHD people, dyslexic people, and such. Around, a dozen years ago or so, I started publishing work around what I call the neurodiversity paradigm. Came up with that a couple of decades ago because I saw there was a confusion around, well, what is what is neurodiversity exactly? What are the implications of this idea of neurodiversity? And so I thought it was useful to differentiate between this biological fact of neurodiversity, that is, there is an enormous diversity in how human minds function, and differentiate between that and what I saw as an emerging neurodiversity paradigm, which was a particular way of approaching neurodiversity. And so what I argued was that currently the dominant societal attitude towards neurodiversity is what I call a pathology paradigm, where there was this idea that there's one right or normal way for a human mind to function, and that anything that deviates significantly from that dominant societal standard of normal is pathologized, is treated as a disorder, as though there's something wrong with you. And so I describe this emergent neurodiversity paradigm as something to shift towards, to shift away from the pathology paradigm towards this neurodiversity paradigm. And the idea with the neurodiversity paradigm was we started from this premise that just like there's no normal ethnicity or normal culture, there's no normal way for a human mind and nervous system to function, no normal body mind that we hold up as the natural default. And instead we have diversity in the same way we have ethnic diversity and cultural diversity and gender diversity and diversity of sexual orientation. So the idea with the neurodiversity paradigm was this framework where we would treat neurodiversity in the same way that ideally we treat other forms of human diversity. No one is pathologized, no one is held up as the one right and normal way to be, and we recognize that the pathologizing of a neurominority group like autistic people is really essentially the same dynamic as we see in other forms of social hierarchies built around diversity, like the one-time pathologizing of gay people, for instance. Many of us, including me, are old enough that we remember when that was, being gay was in the DSM. It was a mental disorder. And so, of course, society is outgrowing that. And so I was suggesting also, the neurodiversity paradigm is recognizing that to pathologize people for being autistic is like pathologizing people for being gay. And also to recognize, and to me, this was the heart of it, and sort of took the neurodiversity paradigm beyond the social justice concerns of the neurodiversity movement. The heart of it was also looking at neurodiversity as a source of cultural creativity, the way we do with cultural diversity. So all of this kind of has evolved, informed the discourse. There's an emerging field of neurodiversity studies now. And where I'm at right now in terms of my work and my interests, a lot of my work is around this thing called neuroqueer theory. There's two basic premises to neuroqueer theory, and one is neuronormativity, this imposition of particular norms of cognitive functioning, this pathology paradigm idea of imposed norms of performance, acting, this pressure, for neurominority people to hide their modes of embodiment and thought and conform to dominant societal norms. This neuronormativity functions very much like heteronormativity does, and the imposed, societally imposed gender binary. And like heteronormativity, neuronormativity can be queered. And so when people intentionally diverge from norms of heteronormative performance, we call that queering, queering heteronormativity. And one can also, by embodying one's divergences from neuronormativity, one also queers neuronormativity. And so that was one premise of neuroqueer theory. And the other is that neuronormativity and heteronormativity are entwined. They're inextricable from each other, that neuronormative performance, the demands of neuronormative performance and the demands of heteronormative performance are so pervasive in terms of how people are supposed to embody themselves and act, that they really inform every aspect of our embodied selves and what the dominant cultural pressures are in terms of how to perform, how to do being human. And so they're so entwined that ultimately to queer one significantly is to start queering the other as well, that deviate far enough from heteronormativity and you're also outside of neuronormativity and vice versa. So neuroqueer theory is one thing I'm playing with. And the looking at what the ethics of this is, there's an obvious ethical implication of the neurodiversity paradigm, which is the treat it the way people who aren't total bigots treat cultural diversity or ethnic diversity, treat neurodiversity that way. So we don't pathologize neurominority groups and or exclude their voices from our work about them. And so we recognize, for instance, that if you have a conference about, an academic conference or paper about women's health and there are no women involved, this is a problem. That's easily recognized now. Or a conference about Black culture with no Black scholars involved. We recognize this is a problem. We still widely accept the idea of a conference about autism with no autistic leadership and no autistic scholars. So, that to me is unethical. Likewise, a part of the ethics of the neurodiversity paradigm are thinking about the consequences of the language we use. That autistic people and autistic children especially are abused and traumatized continually in society. It's commonplace and in fact, perhaps universal in today's society for autistic people to be horrifically traumatized in childhood. And then the symptoms of trauma are framed as symptoms of this horrible disorder, autism. It's regarded as, because autism is framed as a disorder, the idea that a person can be autistic and thriving as an autistic person isn't even present in the dominant culture and in the dominant narrative on autism. And the part of this is autistic children being traumatized and abused in the name of making them less autistic, and autistic children being subjected to abusive behaviorist therapies to try to force them into neuronormative performance and heteronormative performance as well. And how we in academia talk about and write about autism can pull things away from that, this culture in which neurodivergent children are routinely traumatized and brutalized, or it can reinforce that. And most of the academic discourse reinforces that. And when we use the language of the pathology paradigm, we reinforce this culture of abuse. And so anytime you describe autism in academic writing or academic discourse, anytime someone describes autism as a condition, for instance, they're medicalizing it and thereby reinforcing the idea that it's something that can and should be cured or treated, and thus contributing to the trauma and abuse inflicted on autistic children. So, and contributing to silencing adult autistic voices, because when you frame autism as a condition and medicalize it or as a disorder or any such thing, what we're doing is discrediting autistic voices as though your viewpoint of your account of your own experience or your theories, your role in the discourse is suspect because it's just symptoms of disorder. There's, neuroqueer theory plays into this ethic as well, and we're increasingly seeing this in the discourse on transgendered people, because exceptionally high proportion of autistic people are transgender. There's more transgendered people, a higher percentage of transgender people and general queerness within the autistic population and the neurodivergent population in general than within the non-autistic population. So that's being weaponized in the battle against trans people right now, right? It's been being weaponized in all the anti-trans legislation as autistic people are a vulnerable group that has to be protected. Autistic people are a vulnerable group that has to be protected from this transgender trend, because autistic people aren't qualified to recognize what their own genders are and are thus susceptible to this transgender culture trend, or whatever the transphobes are calling it now. And so they become, ethically, when we frame autism as a pathology using language like condition, or framing it as or saying people with autism instead of autistic people, or framing autistic actions as symptoms or behaviors. What we're doing is discrediting, we're contributing to this discourse and rhetoric in which autistic people are framed as lacking awareness of self and other, and thus incapable of incapable of well-informed agency. So that's part of the ethics, I think, of thinking about what the ethical implications are of the neurodiversity paradigm. The other piece that's very central to my work these days is this idea of neurocosmopolitanism. And so we have this idea of cosmopolitanism that I love, and cosmopolitanism is a an approach to cultural diversity. It's an attitude towards cultural diversity. It's like an anti-nationalism, the opposite of nationalism, the opposite of provincialism. And so that nationalist or provincial idea is, well, the way that my people do things is the right and natural way, and other people are inferior or savages or exotic or in need of learning my ways, or just the way they do things is weird. Everybody else has an accent. I don't have an accent. I talk the normal way. And the cosmopolitan attitude is recognizing that there's no normal or natural culture, no culture that's the natural default, but where one usually wildly diverse human family. And so cosmopolitanism is about transcending the provincialist mindset and the boundaries of nationalism, and thinking, how do we interact as a human family, as a diverse human family, and honor the diversity, honor both the unity, the essential unity, and the diversity, and such that that diversity becomes a source of creative synergy and hybridity. Because so much, if we look at, sciences and technologies and the arts and literature and food, music, so much great stuff throughout history comes from cross-cultural synergies and hybridities. And it's very easy to focus entirely on, culture contact as, this country colonized this one, and this country oppressed this one, and this is his history of conflict and domination. But there's this other thing happening also cross-culturally throughout history of exchange of ideas and cultural exchange and cultural hybridity, which is beautiful in this huge source of human creativity and human cultural enrichment. And I love in particular the work of philosopher Edgar Morin, and Morin's book. I love Morin's book Homeland Earth, where he talks a lot about cosmopolitanism as a source of creativity and a source of ultimately, solutions to human problems. And he talks about this idea of the genius of diversity, that as his lovely phrase, homogeneity lacks genius. And it speaks of the genius of diversity, that bringing all these different diverse minds and perspectives together gives you these synergies and this creative power. And there's this genius and diversity that only gets realized, only gets brought to manifestation if the diversity is allowed to actually be diversity. And so it's lost when people are forced to assimilate or forced to conform. It's like, it doesn't matter if you bring in people of a lot of different races and ethnicities into a corporate culture or an academic culture or a research team or whatever it is, or it doesn't matter if you bring, a lot of people in and try to get a diversity of skin color in there. If you make everybody act the same and, demand that they conform to certain dominant cultural modes of thought and interaction, a lot of the genius of diversity is lost. The genius of diversity comes when people get to actually express their different cultural perspectives and experiences and ways of being, and actually have to do the work of understanding each other and translating and working across, with nobody having to fit themselves into the box of somebody else's expectations and demands. So, so neurocosmopolitanism simply applies the same idea of cosmopolitanism takes it from cultural diversity and extends it to neurodiversity. And so, same idea, we're looking at the genius of diversity and how, we get different perspectives and different ways of thinking from cultural diversity, but also very obviously from neurodiversity, from the fact that, there's a wide diversity among humans in how our minds work, regardless of culture. And just based on, genetic variations in neurocognitive functioning and neurocognitive functioning, variations in neurocognitive functioning giving us different sensory experiences, which form into different embodied cognitive experiences. And so that also becomes this rich source of cultural creativity, even if everyone is present is from the same general cultural background. Neurodiversity alone provides a certain genius of diversity. And of course, when it's combined, when it intersects cultural diversity and gender diversity and ethnic diversity and such, you get an even broader spectrum of wildly different human perspectives and ways of thinking. And the genius of diversity is amplified. And again, this only happens when people are not required to assimilate in order to participate, when people can participate as their selves without having to perform neuronormativity. And so in terms of the ethics, I think about, the concerns of like the neurodiversity movement as a social justice movement tend to be around harm. What is the harm to individuals? What is the harm to neurominority individuals that comes from pathologizing them and portraying their ways of thinking and knowing and experiencing as disordered and less than? And certainly that harm is considerable, and we have an ethical imperative to find ways to stop that harm and to avoid furthering it by breaking away from the pathology paradigm, making that shift away from the pathology paradigm and away from valorizing neuronormativity and supporting neuroqueerness and welcoming and embracing it. But also, apart from just harm reduction or eliminating harm, there's this, I think, especially at a time when humanity is faced with all sorts of all manner of crisis and all our human genius is needed to navigate us to a better future. There's an ethical imperative to foster the genius of diversity. And there's to focus on not just on what harm is being done, but also there's sort of the subtle, pervasive, passive harm that happens by missing out on the genius of diversity, missing out on aspects of that genius. We've created essentially, so much has been contributed. We look at, great neurodivergent thinkers like Einstein, Alan Turing, and, essentially we've created this bizarre society where, on the one hand, children are taught how smart Einstein was, and on the other hand, the education system and field of psychology and such does everything possible to make sure that there's never another Einstein. And so I think there's also an ethical imperative for humanity at this point to embrace neurodiversity in this neurocosmopolitan spirit, and to foster the genius of diversity in that way, to foster the genius of diversity by doing everything possible to foster the cultural participation of neurodivergent people as their fully wildly neuroqueer selves, and really to actively encourage it. One of the things I'm always aiming for the positive, for goals, not just like, okay, what are the problems we need to address, but how can we take this, what future do we want to aim for? What positive goals do we want to aim for? And one of the ideas I'm really into with neuroqueer theory is the idea that this is something anyone can do, that the act of queering normativity, heteronormativity, neuronormativity, is something that anybody can do, that everybody has this potential to develop their minds in weird and unique ways, and develop their own unique genius and weirdness and embody it. And so I think the neurodiversity movement has become very limited by, like most societal discourse, has become extremely limited by identity politics, and the way that identity politics puts people into little boxes. And it's like, oh yeah, okay, you fit in this little box because you were born that way, and you fit in this little box because you were born that way. But that too is a limitation on human creative potential, and creates what I think is a very unethical sort of gatekeeping of, oh yeah, we get to be queer and weird and think differently because we were born this particular way. But human beings have neuroplasticity. Our brains can change through practice and action. And so I'm very interested in how everyone can liberate themselves from the confines of neuronormativity and heteronormativity, and find their own unique genius. And to me, the work that people do, transforming their minds with psychedelics, or transforming their minds with meditation and other transformative practices, is just as much a part of neuroqueering as autistic people expressing their natural autistic embodiments. And I think that that's a crucial fusion to look at, that this all is part of the same cultivation of the genius of diversity. So that is all I have to say about that. I want to open this up to 20 minutes or so of questions about whatever interests you, because I don't know you all yet. I don't know what your particular interests and passions and concerns are. So hook me up. Let's answer some questions.
So I'm happy to field any questions from the chat or to help call on people. I was just going to ask if people could give me just a brief sentence about who they are before they ask their question. We have people from philosophy, from the Center for Applied Ethics, and various places. So just a quick, and feel free to turn your cameras on. Again, this can be fairly casual. You're welcome to raise your hand or pop a question in chat, whatever's easiest. Yes, Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm professor of philosophy.
Hi, Chris.
Hi. So once we've got this very broad conception of neurodiversity as including things that one can change about oneself through all sorts of practices, and in particular, once we've got the sort of broader conception of mind that you're clearly working with when you talk about the body-mind, this very embodied, lived sort of mind. I wonder what's at stake for you now in the neuro prefix, in talking about neurodiversity rather than just diversity.
Yeah, well, I mean, if we call it just diversity, I think that blurs things too much because, you know, there's so many different kinds of diversity, so many, and yes, of course, I'm in favor of, you know, every possible axis of human diversity being part, you know, as part of the potential, part of the genius of diversity. And so, you know, all of these different liberatory approaches and inclusive approaches to human diversity, you know, anti-racist and anti-colonialist work, and you know, anti-nationalist work, there's all these different ways we work with different sorts of human diversity. But I think that the neuro is extremely useful to have in there because we're talking about, well, how minds work. And so yeah, I'm very interested, you know, as a somatic psychologist, in neuroplasticity and in embodiment. How is cognition embodied, and how are our actions and embodied ways of being in the world altering our consciousness by building new neural pathways? And so to me, that's really crucial, and something that's neglected in traditional discourses on neurocosmopolitanism and such, and or on cosmopolitanism in the cultural sense. I think it's really important to have this concept of neurodiversity and of neuroqueering and of neurocosmopolitanism, and this whole idea that quite apart from any other axis of diversity, there's just this diversity of different ways of thinking, even within a homogeneous cultural group. And that this is, there's all these potentials of human consciousness that, thanks to neuroplasticity, are available to us through practice and through action, and ways that we can transform ourselves and transform our consciousness. And so, yeah, that's where I think that having that neuro prefix in there is of particular value in drawing our attention to a specific underdeveloped aspect of the genius of diversity.
Thanks.
Sure.
I think Caroline is next.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for your talk. That's been really interesting and very informative. So I'm also interested in, I'm a philosophy PhD student, and I'm interested in philosophy of science. And I'm also interested in different diversity concepts. And so throughout your talk, you sort of suggested that that we can view cultural diversity and neurodiversity somewhat analogous in some ways. And I think, I'm not sure if that's a full-blown worry yet, but I think at least one concern that I have is that when people are nowadays using diversity in terms of race or in terms of gender, very often talk of diversity removes any social justice concerns. So very often, I think diversity is used as a label to where people are tokenized in a certain way, where they are forced to speak in a specific perspective that they may or may not have. So to me, it seems like that doesn't happen as much with neurodiversity. and it might be because, you know, neurodiversity hasn't been yet sort of co-opted in like this way that that diversity in terms of culture has been. So yeah, so I'm wondering where you see the differences, and I think you already raised some of these, you know, some of these issues by pointing to the ethical dimension. But yeah, so I'm just wondering what you think of that, Rory, and yeah, and how you think neurodiversity can sort of avoid being co-opted by a neoliberal understanding of diversity.
It's very much being co-opted by that neoliberal understanding, and I've watched it happen over the past decade in a very big way. It's definitely happening. To where, for instance, there's a Stanford Neurodiversity Project at Stanford University, which is entirely run by neurotypical people, autistic leadership and other neurodivergent leadership. It's absolutely unwelcome. The only time they bring in actual neurominority people, it's like people like Temple Grandin, who've built their whole career on, you know, telling neurotypical people what they want to hear and selling out their own people by pathologizing themselves. And the Stanford Neurodiversity Project is completely oriented towards, well, we pathologize autistic people, and we try to we look for ways to normalize autistic children and such, but also we're very interested in neurodiversity in the corporate world, and especially the tech world, and how can we exploit autistic labor better in the tech industry. And that's the entire focus of it. And there's whole conferences. There's like this, annual Autism at Work conference now about token autistic employees, and how can we exploit autistic labor in software industry and other industries. I got invited to speak at one of those Autism at Work conferences once, and at the last minute, somebody found out what my work is actually about, and they canceled the talk at the last minute. I was like, I'm not refunding your speaker fee or anything. Are you gonna pay me to not show up? And basically the answer was yes. Like, they were willing to just pay me to not show up at that point, because they found out what I was actually gonna talk about. But yeah, so that's very much happening already. And there's even there's this telltale sign, which is that they miss the neoliberal tokenizers all misuse the word diverse to mean as like a euphemism for marginalized or oppressed, like as if like, white cisgender white cisgender neurotypical people are not part of diversity. They're the normal ones who are outside of diversity, and diversity is everybody else. And so I see Black people described as racially diverse, meaning different from white people, and gender minorities being described as gender diverse. And now they also use the term neurodiverse instead of neurodivergent, because God forbid they use, neurodivergent, a term coined by an autistic woman of color, So now, that's a telltale sign. When I see neurodiverse, I'm like, ooh, okay, neoliberal co-opter. But yeah, so it is happening. And it's going to happen till we overthrow capitalism, or that whole system just collapses, which eventually it will collapse, because things do eventually. So it's a legit concern, and I don't think anything can be done about it, except we keep building something else. We build a better, queerer, more neurocosmopolitan world in the cracks of the crumbling old system, and just, let them do their thing and don't get involved in that. So, I mean, that's I'm much more interested in I do very much believe that the old systems of oppression and the old hierarchies and such are in a state of collapse, and that the reason that we're seeing so much rabid transphobia and so much rabid autistic and just upsurges in fascism and nationalism is because the people who are attached to that stuff are getting desperate. The people who fear change and diversity and the uncertainty it brings are increasingly desperate as their systems collapse. So I'm just much more interested in like, what can we build in the cracks and widen the cracks and help that collapse happen, instead of directly fighting the systems that, really just get strengthened by direct opposition.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. And on that note, I think David was next.
Great, thank you, Matthew, for organizing this, and Nick for the really beautiful presentation. I'm David Silver. I'm an ethicist in the Center for Applied Ethics here, well, where I am. And I want to invite you to talk about, I guess, how radical the ideas you're presenting here are, in the sense that one project is kind of an egalitarianism, to say here is a group of people who have been unjustly harmed, wronged, so on and so forth, neurodiverse, neuroatypical people, and one project is just to say the equality of neurotypical and atypical people. I'm wondering to the extent you're also embracing a more radical proposal that actually flips the script and says we're all neuroqueer. And that some people are more so than others, perhaps, that feel the constraints more or fight against them more, and that you have a project of liberating everybody who is, in a sense, again, neuroqueer in some way.
You got me. Yeah, I'm saying everyone is potentially neuroqueer. So I'm saying that, neuroqueering is available to anyone. Anybody can liberate themselves through action and choice, can intentionally liberate themselves from the confines of both heteronormativity and neuronormativity, and can and should. I will say that, yeah, I'm in favor of killing normativity by queering it on both an individual, embodied, and cultural level. And that is a radical departure from the identity politics of the neurodiversity movement. That's like, which I'm also in favor of course, the equality for autistic people and other neurominority groups. But yeah, it is, I am saying that just thanks to human neuroplasticity, we can all alter our consciousness and our embodiment in ways that bring us out of the confines of normativity, and that harnessing the genius of human diversity and is really contingent on that we can increase and actively cultivate the genius of diversity by queering ourselves further. So yeah, that is you're correct. That is a radical idea, and one which sometimes enrages both the conservative, anti-queer, anti-diversity elements, and the radical identity politics contingent.
Yeah.
Because
I was just going to follow, and this is just going to be a comment, and I let Spencer follow with a question. Just that a lot of norms are oppressive and constricting, and some norms are liberating. like
Yes.
the norms of not killing each other, so on and so forth. And so I'm just going to accept on your behalf that you have a system of which norms are which. You want to free from some, but not from all of them, right? So that would just be a yes, no, and then we'll let Spencer get on to the.
Yes, well, I am, I mean, I I'm in favor of kindness and people treating each other well, and I think that uh, I think that attachment to normativity and really attachment to normativity in general um, is a major source of violence and cruelty and warfare and oppression. And so, we look at why do people kill each other? What are the reasons? And it's not generally, I mean, you can generally trace it back to this chronic fear of uncertainty and ambiguity that happens, that drives people towards nationalism and towards hating the other, or norms of toxic norms of masculinity and such. And so, in that sense, I mean, I'm a proponent of nonviolence in the sense that I'm looking for where so much violence is rooted in normativity and rooted in fear of losing the certainties that normativity brings.
Spencer, I think you're next.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for coming. I really enjoyed the talk. I've also, Matthew introduced me to some of your work, and I'm grateful for that because, I mean, it really has broadened my perspective and changed the way I've been thinking about, mental wellness and mental difference. Thank you for that. I guess I kind of just want to invite you to say a little bit about the implications that the neurodiversity paradigm has for the science of psychiatry as you see it. And also, I'm a bit curious about whether you see or whether you've thought about parallels and differences with the anti-psychiatry movement in the 60s, with the kind of movement that you're trying to articulate here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I want to endorse the work of my my colleague and fellow autistic scholar Robert Chapman, because Dr. Chapman has been writing a great deal about psychiatry and the neurodiversity movement, the neurodiversity paradigm, and anti-psychiatry and such. And I think he's got some very nuanced analyses of that stuff. So I'll endorse his work there on that for a more in-depth view. I'm not anti-psychiatry, and I think that it would call adoption of the neurodiversity paradigm involves a radical rethinking of psychiatry and its purpose and its ethics, because psychiatry so often has been a tool of social control and a tool of imposing normativity. But psychological distress is very real. And so I think I'll say I don't believe in mental illness. And I think that too much of the field of psychiatry is, to a large extent, the field of psychiatry has let itself become built around this construction of mental illness, where psychological distress is viewed as biological brain disorders and that have to be treated with medicine. And I don't buy that at all. I think that to some extent what we're looking at is there's neurodivergence that is pathologized simply because it's different, simply because it diverges from norms. And psychiatry has no business trying to enforce normativity. And so it's, you know, the essence of the pathology paradigm is framing divergence from normativity as illness. But certainly, you know, there are people who are in genuine deep psychological distress. And I think that you know, abolishing the field of psychiatry or something, you know, that radical anti-psychiatry view, you know, misses the potentials of a reformed psychiatry to treat psychological distress, which I mean is why most people get into the field in the first place, to alleviate human suffering, because the psychological distress is real and generally the result of a few different things. Most psychological distress is the result of trauma. And I think it's ridiculous to call trauma illness. I think that has the effect of concealing the origins of trauma much of the time. You know, when you call people's trauma illness, you pin it on their faulty biology instead of on the experiences that traumatized them. And so, you know, but trauma causes psychological distress and causes things, you know, I mean, it's possible to be a thriving, healthy autistic person. But so I'm against calling autism a disorder. But post-traumatic stress disorder, oh, I would definitely call that a disorder. Absolutely. You know, that's a serious disorder, which is caused by trauma, and it has disrupted some order of the psyche, you know, thrown it into disorder. And nobody wants post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, they want that pre-trauma order restored to their psyche. So I think that you know, I mean, and then there's trauma and distress that's caused by a person's particular neurocognitive style not being accommodated. And so autistic people in distress get pathologized for being autistic rather than, you know, looking at, you know, how are these people being accommodated? And I think very often in the field of psychiatry, things get called illnesses when what's actually happening is the people are suffering because the ways that their minds function are not being well accommodated in society and in the way they're raised. So yeah, I would get rid of that whole mental illness concept, which is something I have in common with the anti-psychiatry people. But I do believe that psychiatry has potentially a very important role in treating psychological distress. And, you know, the radical anti-psychiatry folks that I know tend to be very much like, nothing should be pathologized. And I'm like, no, the heck with that. You know, I've having spent a few decades recovering from PTSD, I'm like, no, pathologize PTSD, man. Pathologize these trauma, these results of trauma. Treat them as disorders so we can look at how to fix them, how to heal them. Same with you know, again, the radical anti-psychiatry view tends to be completely anti-psych meds. My view is I'm completely in favor of cognitive liberty. People have the right to do anything they want with their own minds, whatever works for them. I'm very much against anybody ever being forcibly medicated. But I know a lot of people whose lives are better because of some psychiatric drug or another, and they should be able to take those, and they should be able to go to a psychiatrist and talk through their options about medication and see if that's right for them. And so yeah, I'm definitely not anti-psychiatry, and I think that there's definitely a lot of room for psychiatry to be very compatible with the neurodiversity paradigm.
Thank you.
Okay, so I know we're just past 1, and I know Nick's schedule is very busy. He has other things to go to. But thank you so much for being here. I'm sure there were other kind words from people in the chat. It's been fantastic. And thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you all very much.